Democrats must recognize that Zoran Mamdani is the future of the party. Unfortunately, it's the Republican Party. If you missed his victory speech in last week's mayoral election in New York, don't worry. You'll see it in every attack ad for the next 2 years.
Bill Maher there slamming future New York City Mayor Zoran Mamdani for embracing socialism during his campaign.
The 34-year-old mayor-elect ran on the Democratic ticket, but is a self-proclaimed Democratic socialist, something that Maher suggests cannot be the future of the Democratic Party if they plan to win elections in the future.
Before the whole left side of the country catches socialism fever, let's listen to the other big winner in last Tuesday's election, Virginia Governor-elect Abigail Spanberger, who, before the 24 election, said things like, if the party didn't shift to the center, we will get torn apart. And we need to never use the word socialist or socialism ever again. Well, she was right, but they didn't listen. Typical, am I right, ladies?
Maher says this isn't a one-off either. Take a listen to what he said next.
This isn't rocket science. All the left-leaning think tanks have done autopsies on 2024, and they all came up with the same message: move to the center. Even the New York Times, which did so much to promote woke politics, now says the partisans are wrong. Moving to the center is the way to win. And Democrats should recognize the party moved too far left on social issues after Obama left office. Gosh, if only someone had been saying that all along.
Maher did later point out that the US already has prime examples of socialist policy like Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid. But he says while those programs to, quote, soften the edges of capitalism, one of the real dangers of socialism is the woke ideology that he says comes with it. Take a listen.
The DSA are radicals about this concept, and radical economic policy is always ineluctably married to radical social policy. Their platform, for example, calls for completely open borders. You think you're going to win an election on that? This just seems like more extremism at a time when Americans are begging both parties, please, could just one of you act normal?
So what I find, I know you don't care for Bill Maher. What I find interesting about this clip is that he sounds to be like he's mostly criticizing extremely progressive left social policies, and despite socialism having the word social in it, actually the policies that are defining of socialism are mostly economic in nature rather than, right, he's criticizing wokeness, but what we call wokeness or political correctness is a newer innovation in progressive thought than socialism, which was just about economic policies. Now, maybe you can argue there's some connection, and that's kind of what he's arguing there. But now, I also think socialism is very bad. I think the Democratic Socialists of America have not demonstrated themselves to be a particularly wise or politically influential, or have grasped onto some political knowledge other than the clear success of a Bernie Sanders type figure. AOC, those people who, but they're very, they define socialism in just this vague way such that no one can be against it, which at that point then I'm like, well, why are you then trying to even rehabilitate the term? If what you're going to say is, by socialism, I mean some protections for workers and some welfare programs. Well, yes, we have welfare. European countries have welfare, and they're not socialist countries. To me, socialism, and not just to me because it's the actual definition, socialism is a economic system, is a competitive system, an alternative system for a market economy, where the economy is centrally managed and directed by a group of, in pure socialist thought, the workers take the means of production. In practice, what that always means is some government committee plans the economy and decides how many what gets built and what factory opens and what you charge for it, and that leads to crippling poverty every single time. But it's not a market economy with welfare. That's just social democracy.
So we could have a whole debate about whether what you just described is socialism or Marxism and how those intersect, but
Marxism is nonsense. You got to agree with me on that one.
I'm not a Marxist, Rob. I'm not a Marxist,
yes.
so let's be clear about that. But to the Bill Maher point, one of the reasons that you correctly note that he irritates me quite a lot is that his fundamental view is that whatever he happens to believe is the way forward for Democrats to win elections. In the New York mayoral election, there was a candidate espousing exactly what Bill Maher is espousing. His name was Andrew Cuomo, and he got kicked around by the voters twice, both in the Democratic primary and in the general election.
New York.
In New York, yes. But we're not, nobody is saying, like, this idea about for example, a centrally directed economy and so on. Mamdani isn't even in New York commending or advocating a centrally planned economy. He's talking about free childcare for kids 5 and under, free buses, financed by a modest increase in the corporate tax rate and an even more modest increase in the city income tax rate for people whose income is over $1 million. That obviously has support, otherwise he would not be the mayor-elect of New York City. Bill Maher also, I'm sorry to get into a rant, but he really does irk me in all sorts of ways. Bill Maher, for example, espouses and has espoused throughout the past 2 years extremely strong support for Israel and what it's doing in Gaza. Lots of people on the left and increasing numbers of people on the right are appalled by that. It is an unpopular policy at this point to have the views that he holds. Will he ever admit that? No chance he'll ever admit that. So, Bill Maher frustrates me quite a lot.
I agree that the foreign policy views he espouses are out of step with the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, frankly. But I think his point on what would be generally helpful for electing more Democrats is probably correct in the sense that states like Virginia or Arizona or Pennsylvania that are generally up for grabs are going to be places where, but I don't know, it gets more complicated because an economically populist message is to some extent a message Republicans have themselves adopted. Now, I don't think it depends what we mean by economic populism. Again, I think free markets are better, free trade is better. I want to have lower taxes and less regulation. I'm not going to abolish welfare tomorrow. We can have welfare, it's fine. In fact, I'd rather have more welfare and less regulation, as I've made clear in many of our recent conversations. Yep. I would rather have more welfare and less central planning. The Trump administration, apart from its tech policy, which is a completely hands-off, Reagan-esque 1980s style free market libertarian wet dream, its tech policy is that. Its other industrial policies and economic policies have been broadly way too protectionist for my measures. But that combination might be popular.
Just briefly on that point, Rob, because I know we're almost out of time. I do think that part of the appeal of Bernie Sanders, of AOC, of Mamdani, beyond their geographical constituencies, is that they share with a great proportion of the population unhappiness with the status quo, the belief that the system is rigged against regular people. And I think one of the problems the Democratic Party has had, particularly in last year's election, was the idea that it was, in a sense, defending the status quo. And that was a very unpopular thing to be doing.
Well, one side or the other always has to defend the status quo because one side or the other has to represent the status quo.
Well, maybe the Republicans will be the status quo next time around.
Yep.
Up next, Tim Dillon didn't hold back in criticising President Trump, even saying that this was, quote, the end of his administration. What's all that about? Find out and stay with us after this.